Well, Molly gave a great lead-in to the sermon for today because this morning, I know it's going to sound really exciting. I want to talk with you about dirt. That's what you came to church for, right? All right, I didn't hear any amens there. All right, so let me start off by sharing with you two different stories about dirt, and then we'll get into soil. Soil is dirt, but dirt is not soil, and then we'll go from there. So story number one, it took place in 2005. It was early morning. It was in southern India. My roommate Aaron and I were sleeping on these cots in the middle of a village, miles from anywhere else. We were actually spending time in a Dalit village, an untouchable village, if you've ever read any of the stories about the untouchables before. And we're sleeping in this village, and there's a knock on the door early. And so we open the doors, and there are two of our new friends from last night. Now, they don't speak, we don't speak Hindi or any other language, and they don't speak English. So there's just a lot of sign symbols back and forth. But the gist of it was this. We were going to go with them and work in the rice fields. We had kind of planned this out last night between different signs and interpreters. So we get in this old car. It's wonderful. And we bounce around these roads on the hard clay, and the sun is coming up. And we get to the rice fields, and there are the oxen in two different fields. The fields are really not very big at all, maybe about the size of the sanctuary here. And they teach us the signs for go, or the words for go and for speed up. And so I step down into this rice field. And I don't know if you've ever been to a rice field before in India, but it's this red clay kind of dirt. And you kind of sink to it. It kind of goes up to about your knees. And then we had these oxen. And I wasn't too worried about the warnings that we had about the scorpions and the flesh-eating bacteria and stuff that were in there. I was more concerned about the oxen and starting and stopping. But we got in there, and they gave us the commands, and they kind of left. And Aaron and I were in the fields, and so we started plowing the dirt with these oxen. And instead of going in a straight line like you're supposed to, we were zigzagging back and forth. And I think the oxen had got a kick out of these two foreigners from the States trying to plow the fields. I did happen to look up at one point in time, though, and I saw our new friends on the hood of the car, and they had taken my camera. This is back before we had digital cameras. And they were taking selfies with one another. So when I got back home, I had like 100 pictures of these guys just taking pictures. But as I plowed those fields, I really thought about what it meant like to be in there in the dirt, in the soil, and in southern India especially, the fields there, the rice that they produce, it is the essence of the culture, the essence of who they are. So that's one story. The other story just took place, a couple of years ago, but every year, really. Every spring on my parents' farm, so my sister and I were the sixth generation to live into the farmhouse. I think I've shared that with you before. So my father's father, grandfather, you got that? Founded the farm in the 1830s. And in this one patch of land, every spring, we turn over the soil and we plant potatoes right around the beginning of March, depending on what the weather is like. And we reach into that soil. And when we plant potatoes, and there's nothing better than in July when you dig those potatoes up and fry them with some butter, the real stuff, butter and salt and everything else. But when you're working in that soil, I always like to, in that beginning of spring, I like to work in the garden barefoot because you can feel that soil and it works up through you and it makes you feel so alive. And it makes me think about the connection that my father and his father and his father and his father had with that land. And then in some way, how we're all connected with the soil, with the land, with one another. So keeping those two stories in mind, I want to think about the soil of our own lives, both literally and metaphorically. Now, in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, God takes a handful of soil and, as it's described in Genesis, breathes on it. And from that soil, from the breath of God, the Adamah, that's the Hebrew word, Adam, the breath of life is created. Now, it sounds different to us today, but in the ancient world, they would think of themselves as soil people. Is that how you think of yourself today? Soil people. There is this intrinsic thought, intrinsic belief that we are birthed from the soil. The word human originates from the Latin word humus, which means organic and decaying plant material and dirt. All right, so we got all of that. You feel like you're versed in soil and dirt now? Okay, I can tell you're riveted. All right. Let's look at our scripture for today. The scripture for today takes place from the prophet Jeremiah. Now, last week, if you were here with us, we heard from the prophet Isaiah. And with the prophet Isaiah, there were words being spoken when the army from the north, from the Assyrian army, was coming down south and capture was inevitable. Now we're hearing from the prophet Jeremiah when the people of Israel have been captured and put into exile, into captivity in the land that is not their own, spread throughout the Assyrian Empire. And listen to what Jeremiah says, speaking on behalf of the voice of God, when telling people how they should live in exile. Jeremiah says, "Build houses and make yourselves at home. Put in gardens and eat what grows in that country. Marry and have children. Encourage your children to marry and have children so that you'll thrive in that country and not waste away. Make yourselves at home there and work for the country's welfare. Pray for Babylon's well-being." Remember, the Babylonians, the Assyrian Empire, that's who overtook them. "If things go well for Babylon, things will go well for you." So think about this just for a moment. The people of Israel have been captured. They've been put into exile. Their entire way of living has been overturned. And the word that comes to them from the prophet Jeremiah is not to revolt, not to gather together and to fight those that have conquered them. Rather, Jeremiah says, grow your family and grow a garden. Isn't that interesting? Grow a garden for the welfare of your city. So maybe you can see where I'm going with all of this. One of the main goals, the main projects that we're going to have for this year in 2019 is a community garden, the Joe and Betty Brimmer Memorial Garden. So when you drive into our driveway, if you look to the left, that's where the community garden will be. And as soon as we get everything complete with the wonderful Planning and Zoning Committee of Manchester, the construction will begin. But we'll have a fence there to help deter, not stop, but deter the lovely deer that graze in our fields. And then we're going to have several different beds. We're going to have 3 50-foot-long beds that we're going to work on as part of our community. Then within those beds, we're going to have another 3 beds that will be divided up into squares. The size is a little variable right now. We're probably like 6 foot or 8 foot or something like that. And we're going to have community gardens. We don't know what the interest is going to be from the community, both specifically here in the church and in the larger community. But what we envision is the garden as a place where community can grow and foster. There'll be picnic tables out under the shade tree. There will be a greenhouse that will allow us to plant to start the plants ahead of the season and then also to grow later into the season. There will be opportunities, hopefully, for classes such as that people have volunteered for already, how to can vegetables, how to cook with fresh vegetables, how to work into the soil. We have no idea what this is going to turn out like. It's very much still a work in progress, but here's kind of what we're thinking. Working in the soil can be an act that is sacramental in nature. When you work in the soil, you co-create with God. And so you're creating and building and growing these plants and flowers and vegetables and all of this. Yes, that's one thing that we're going to do. But the other part is we're also growing relationships. We're growing connections, partnerships with one another. Our hope, our dream, our prayer is that the neighborhood, the greater neighborhood, will come together, and that as we learn to grow and to plant, we can also grow and plant our relationships with one another. And of course, this has a very biblical act of it from the very beginnings when God breathes into the soil. And then think about Jesus on that final night when he knows that he's going to be betrayed and crucified by the Roman Empire. Do you remember where he goes? He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he goes there because he wants to find peace, wholeness, shalom, forgiveness, new beginnings. That, in part, is what we're hoping the community garden here will bring to each of us. Now, it's named the Joe and Betty Brimmer Memorial Garden for two reasons. Number one is we have memorial funds available from their estate and from gifts to help plant this garden and to get it started. Number two, Joe and Betty, you may remember, beloved members of our congregation, were missionaries for a long time in Japan. Joe and Betty were the parents of Beth and Marty, their son-in-law. And when Joe would tell the story, and I don't, for those of you who knew Joe, and we showed this one time on one of our services, when he talked about working in Japan as a missionary, he was very clear that he struggled to speak the Japanese language, right? That was never his forte. Betty, his wife, Beth's mom, she could speak 7 or 8 languages fluently, and towards the end of her life there, when she was remembering and reciting scriptures, she'd switch between English and Hindi and Tagalog or whatever. I mean, it was just a variety of languages, right? Joe couldn't do it, but what Joe loved to talk about was the relationships that he formed with individuals, especially those who had had a heavy night of drinking, as they would come into the coffee shop, and Joe would say, we just loved them as they were our best friend that we ever met. And that's what we're hoping to do in the garden, to create those relationships where we welcome people no matter who they are or where they've come from. So here's my challenge to us today. If you want to, even if you might not consider yourself a green thumb, right? If you want to try this spring to get your hands into the soil, to grow some plants, to feel alive, to connect with nature, to harvest the produce that we'll share on Sunday mornings and with others and those in need, and maybe with the circle of concern, we've got to work all of that out still. Come join us. If nothing else, we'll have a series of work days. Try it for one work day. And on Ash Wednesday, when you come forth for our service, whether it's this year or in following years, my guess is that you spend at least a little bit of time in the garden. Then when you walk down that aisle, and when I have the honor and the privilege to put the sign of the cross on your forehead or wrist, I always say these words: from dust you have come, and to dust you will return. And we say that because we are indeed people who come from the soil where God has breathed upon us and where we are connected to the very life which we walk upon every single day. From the soils of Canada to the soils of St. Louis and to the soils of southern India, there is something that intrinsically bonds us with one another. And one of the ways that we can discover that is through working and growing both plants and relationships, cultivating our hearts and our souls. Through Christ we say together, Amen. As we